The first medieval condom was made from something so disgusting you'll gag. A worker holds a wet section of sheep intestine, scraping off the fat, turning it inside out, inflating it by mouth, and tying off one end. This is not a sausage factory. This is a condom factory, and that thing, just inflated by human breath, will be packaged, sold in the market, and then go into, well, you get the idea. The year is 1700, and this is the best solution humanity has to offer. But this isn't the weirdest part. The weirdest part is before sheep intestines, people used things that were far, far worse. Why did humans come to the decision to use sheep intestines for this purpose? What did they try before coming up with this method? Before condoms, what did humans do? To understand why sheep intestines were ever considered a solution, we must return to 15th and 16th century Europe, the moment syphilis began ravaging major cities like Naples, Paris, or London. This was no longer an illness of a few individuals. It became a collective nightmare. Patients developed skin ulcers, prolonged agony, memory loss, and loss of motor functions, with many dying in a state that the medicine of the time could not explain. The terrifying part was no one truly knew what to do. There were no antibiotics, no testing, no modern concept of disease prevention. People only knew one thing: this disease appeared after physical intimacy. And from there, things began to turn literally desperate. Women of that era tried everything to prevent pregnancy: beeswax, olive oil, tree sap, honey, crushed herbs, and even mineral concoctions inserted directly into their bodies in hopes of creating a barrier. Some methods sounded more like alchemy than medicine. But in a world with no better options, anything that might help was worth a try. For men. 16th century medical records describe the application of vegetable oils, tree resin, or animal fat before intercourse, believing these could prevent the disease from infiltrating. There was no evidence this worked, but it revealed something crucial: humans were beginning to think about preventing disease before it happened. And then things got even worse when they started treatments. The most popular method at the time was mercury. Literally, mercury. Patients were smeared with, made to drink, or forced to inhale the vapors of one of the most toxic metals humans have ever used in medicine. Some doctors believed that if a patient drooled enough or sweated long enough, the toxins would exit the body. The results were usually tooth loss, neurological damage, severe emaciation, and prolonged agony. Many died before knowing whether the disease or the cure was what killed them. There was a famous saying at the time: "A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury." Just one sentence, but enough to capture the absolute horror of this era. And this is the point where history began to pivot. When people realized the cure was sometimes more terrifying than the disease, mindsets began to shift. It was no longer, how do we cure it, but rather a much more pragmatic question: how do we avoid getting infected in the first place? And when that question arose, humans began looking at highly unexpected things. The materials, the part that will make you gag. At this point, a natural question arises: who was the first to think of this? No one knows. There is no inventor's name, no exact date of creation. All that remains are scattered medical logs, letters, and commercial documents from the 16th century onwards. But one thing is very clearly recorded: the materials. And that is where the story gets truly disturbing. A. Small intestines of sheep, calves, and pigs. This was the most common material in the history of pre-industrial condoms. The small intestines were taken directly from the slaughterhouse while still warm, slick, and reeking heavily of blood and viscera. The worker had to manually scrape off the exterior fat, turn the inside out to clean it, and soak it in lime water or a mild alkaline solution to reduce the smell and impurities. Reduce the smell, not eliminate it entirely. Even after processing, the material retained the distinct, raw scent of damp animal tissue. When stretched by hand, it was soft and slimy, like a living membrane that hadn't fully dried. And then came the strangest step. The worker brought it to their mouth and blew it up to test for leaks. The sound it made was not like modern latex. It was a wet, flimsy, pulsating noise, much like wet skin being stretched in the air. If it didn't leak, one end of the intestine was tied off, and it was left to dry on a cylindrical wooden mold. Once finished, the material transformed into a thin membrane, almost transparent against the light. In terms of shape, it wasn't as terrifying as many imagine. The problem was, everyone knew exactly what it used to be just a few hours prior. A commercial record from around 1720 describes the Covent Garden area in London as a hub for producing protective items. The workshops were located right next to slaughterhouses and meat markets, meaning from early morning. The floors were covered in dirty water, diluted blood, and the stench of organs. A skilled worker could make about 24 items a day, packing them in soft cloth boxes before distributing them through pharmacies or other discreet channels. This was no longer a personal experiment. It had become a genuine industry. But this still wasn't the weirdest part. B. Fish bladders and pig bladders. In some parts of Asia and Europe, people also used fish bladders or pig bladders. After processing, this material was quite tough, thin, and had decent elasticity. In Edo period Japan, there were versions made of thin animal skin or tissue called kawagata. Despite differing techniques, these methods all shared an unforgettable commonality. The worker had to test the seal by blowing into it directly with their mouth. If it held air, it passed. If it leaked, it was discarded. It sounds simple, but remember, this entire process took place in damp workshops next to slaughterhouses, amidst the smell of blood, dirty water, and animal organs. This is not the imagery modern advertisements want you to picture when discussing protection. See, chemical-soaked linen and the doctor who dared to test it. Then medicine tried a different route. In 1564, Italian physician Gabriele Falloppio described a material made of linen, soaked in metal salts and herbal solutions before being dried. The idea was that these compounds could help reduce the risk of infection. It sounds quite modern until you remember that metal salts of that era caused severe burning, intense irritation, and agony upon direct contact. But the most remarkable part is Falloppio claimed he tested this method on over 1,100 men and recorded 0 cases of syphilis. This is practically one of the first large-scale trials in medical history, and like so many documents of the time, he recorded the results. But he did not record the sensations of the 1,100 men who had to endure it. The product existed. The materials were processed. But here comes the part few people think about: how did they actually use it? The usage process. The more you read, the more you understand why they didn't talk about this at dinner. All right, the materials were sourced, the product was finished. But what shifts this entire story to another level isn't how it was made, it's how it was used in real life. And this is the part people of that era almost never spoke of publicly. Step 1: preparation. When dry, sheep intestines shrink, harden, and lose their elasticity, making them impossible to use immediately. Before usage, It had to be soaked in warm water or warm milk for 15 to 30 minutes to soften it back up. Some records also mention olive oil or almond oil used as a lubricant to reduce friction and prevent tearing, a very real issue with thin biological materials. What is noteworthy is that this entire process felt more like a manual craft than a modern consumer product. Every single use was practically a prep from scratch ritual. Step 2. Putting it on and the ribbon detail. Unlike modern latex, a sheep intestine condom was an open tube, one end was tied shut. But the other end had to be secured during use. According to many 18th century records, it was usually tied off with a ribbon, and some documents specifically describe this ribbon as pink. That tiny detail was no accident. In European society at the time, pink was associated with the high fashion of the aristocracy and wealthy merchants, those who had enough money to use personalized products. In other words, even an incredibly private item could become a status symbol. But this still wasn't the weirdest part. Step 3 after use. What shocks modern people the most, this was not a single-use product. After use, it was washed clean, dried out, folded, and then stored in a wooden or cloth-lined tin box. If well maintained, one product could be reused dozens of times. Some records even mention over 100 uses. This created a completely different logic from today. Instead of use and toss, it became a long-lasting personal item in one's private life. For the rich, it was a personal item. For the lower classes, especially in brothels, it was a different story entirely. In many places, reusing them wasn't a choice. It was mandatory. A single product could be used by multiple people in a short span of time. And when that happened, the fear of disease was almost ever present. A story from an 18th century Paris brothel medical records in Paris from 1750 to 1780 show that high-end establishments in Saint-Germain and Palais Royal often had a dedicated person managing the sheep intestine products. They tested the seal by inflating them, inspecting them visually, and sometimes submerging them in water to look for micro-leaks. Essentially, this was pre-industrial manual quality control. Conversely, in low-end establishments, many steps were skipped entirely, and the results showed up vividly in medical data. Syphilis rates were significantly higher in groups lacking inspection and preservation protocols. A small item, reused dozens of times, sometimes passing through many different hands. And that is when the big question arises: who actually had access to this thing, and who didn't? Who used them class and a pricey item? If you think sheep intestine condoms were accessible to everyone, they weren't. This was essentially the high-end medical technology of its time, and its price was exorbitant enough that most ordinary people could only stare. In 18th century London, a sheep intestine condom cost about 2 to 5 shillings, depending on quality. Meanwhile, an artisan's wage was only about 6 to 10 shillings per week. This meant just one good product could consume half a week's salary. And this didn't even account for replacing it when it tore or degraded after multiple uses. For the aristocracy or wealthy merchants, this was an acceptable cost. For the common laborer, it was a drastically different decision: either spend money that could feed their family for days, or accept the risk of disease, and many chose the risk. Records in London and Paris describe working-class men seeking out cheaper versions, poorly processed intestines, unevenly thin, still carrying a distinct stench of blood, and sometimes so dry and stiff they had to be soaked for a very long time before use. They tore easily, were harder to preserve, but were bought because something is better than nothing. And those who were even poorer had absolutely no choice. They entered relationships with the exact same recurring fears: syphilis, unwanted pregnancies, or a disease that could slowly destroy their bodies over many years. Condoms as gifts. The bizarre thing is, at the same time, on the other side of society, condoms became gifts. In the 18th century French aristocracy, there were small protection boxes lined with velvet or soft leather. Inside were a few carefully folded sheep intestine condoms, sometimes embroidered with a name or a personal monogram. They were given to lovers, mistresses, or patrons as a very discreet signal: I want to continue this relationship, but I do not want to pay the price for it. Not flowers, not jewelry, but manually processed sheep intestines placed in a luxurious box. History sometimes possesses very inexplicable types of romance. Women in high-end prostitution, in luxury brothels across Paris, London, or Venice. Women were usually the ones who understood these products better than anyone else. They knew which types tore easily, which had an overpowering smell, and which needed longer soaking times before use. Some records describe them keeping condoms in separate lock boxes or personal leather pouches, avoiding mixing them with others' belongings. To them, this wasn't just a tool, it was the deciding factor of whether they would stay healthy to keep working, or lie bedridden for months before vanishing from the city without anyone remembering their names. That fear was visceral, because syphilis back then did not kill quickly. It destroyed slowly: rashes, agonizing pain, memory loss, bodily deformation. Many saw patients on the streets every day, so they knew exactly what they were trying to avoid. And that is the most striking point of this entire era. The exact same item created two entirely different worlds. The rich had the ability to prevent. The poor did not. Those with money had the means of protection. Those without didn't. But then another force stepped in, not to help, but to judge. And that force wielded more power than any government at the time. The church steps in things get more complicated. At this point, the story is no longer just a medical issue. It began colliding with the greatest power in Europe at the time, the Catholic Church. From the 16th century onward, the Church generally opposed any methods of preventing pregnancy. The logic was clear: marital relations must always remain open to procreation, as it was deemed the natural order created by God. And within that logic, the condom quickly became a highly suspicious object. Some 17th and 18th century religious texts referred to it as an obstacle to God's will, or an instrument of carnal lust. Clergy were instructed not to use them, not to encourage them, and to warn their congregations to stay away. But then reality set in, and reality does not care about theology. Syphilis continued to spread across Europe, including among the clergy. Medical reports in Italy and France noted that infection rates in religious communities were so high they became an internal crisis. Some monasteries had to isolate the sick. Others recorded monks vanishing for months to seek treatment before returning in a state of severe emaciation. And here is the strangest part: while sermons condemned these sinful objects, the areas surrounding monasteries and seminaries consistently appeared in transaction records for protective items. No one wrote explicitly that the clergy used them. Of course not. But sometimes history doesn't lie in what is written, it lies in what people deliberately avoid mentioning. Imagine the feeling of a 17th century man at the time stepping out of church after hearing a sermon about the sins of the flesh, but simultaneously knowing full well that this disease could cause his body to slowly rot away for years. On one side was the fear of hell. On the other, was the fear of disease, and many people lived their entire lives trapped between those two things. But this was still not the biggest turning point. While Europe was still debating morality versus epidemics, across the Atlantic, a man was standing in front of a boiling pot of rubber and sulfur. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to change the entire game. The turning point, when industrialization changed everything. By the mid-19th century, the history of the condom took a drastically different path. Not because human needs changed, but because the materials changed. In 1839, Charles Goodyear discovered that by mixing natural rubber with sulfur and applying heat, the material became far more durable, elastic, and no longer melted in the heat or froze stiff in the cold. That process was called rubber vulcanization, and what started in a garage smelling of burning rubber and hot sulfur ultimately revolutionized the entire condom manufacturing industry. The first products emerging in the 1840s and 1850s were quite horrific by modern standards: thick, rigid, with some describing the sensation as wearing a miniature rubber boot. But despite the discomfort, they outperformed sheep intestines in one critical aspect: they were far more durable. No more stench of organs. No more soaking in warm water for tens of minutes before use. No more worrying about a thin membrane suddenly tearing mid-act. And that was what truly revolutionized the market. In Ohio and New England, condoms entered industrial assembly lines. Sizes were standardized, molds were fixed. Manufacturing defects began to be systematically inspected, rather than relying entirely on the individual skill of a craftsman. For the first time in history, this product transitioned from a semi-clandestine handmade item into a genuine industrial commodity. But the fascinating thing is, not everyone liked rubber. A segment of wealthy users reverted to sheep intestines, arguing it was more natural and provided a closer sensation. And modern science shows they weren't entirely imagining things. Thin animal intestine material actually conducts heat differently than latex. Then the 1920s arrived, and everything changed again. Liquid latex technology allowed for the creation of membranes that were thinner, more uniform, and vastly cheaper. Condoms began to be mass-produced on a massive scale in the US, UK, and Germany. From here on, it was no longer an exclusive item for the aristocracy or high-end brothels. It became a mass-market product. But sheep intestines did not vanish entirely. Even today, there are high-end product lines made from animal intestine membranes, costing many times more than standard latex and catering to a very small niche of customers. Meaning a principle that existed in blood-smelling rooms in London in 1700 actually never completely disappeared. And amidst all those changes, another bizarre detail persisted throughout history: how humans talked about it. Not in medical documents, but in memoirs, satirical poetry, and bedroom tales passed down through centuries. The small details left by history. Before concluding, there are a few small puzzle pieces from history details that don't change the whole story, but make it feel much more real. Casanova called the condom the armor of Venus, and perhaps that is the most accurate description that era ever produced. In his memoirs, Casanova recounted that he often blew the condom up before use to test for leaks. This wasn't a medical guideline. It was simply the survival experience of a real user. Imagine that scene in an 18th century room, a man standing by candlelight, holding a membrane made from animal intestine, inflating it by mouth as if testing a fragile balloon about to pop. And even Casanova didn't fully trust it. He still double-checked. His lovers still worried. The armor of Venus never made humans feel absolutely safe. Even the name condom remains a mystery. One theory suggests it comes from an English doctor named Dr. Condom. Allegedly serving King Charles II, a king infamous for his complicated love life and dozens of illegitimate children. The problem is, no official records confirm this doctor ever existed. The entire story might just be an oral legend. The earliest trace of the word condom only appears around 1705 in an English satirical poem. Then war broke out and everything changed again. During World War I, the U.S. military initially refused to issue condoms to soldiers for moral reasons. They believed encouraging abstinence was enough, but battlefields do not operate on moral beliefs. The rate of sexually transmitted diseases in the U.S. military quickly surged noticeably higher than in the British and German armies, where condoms were issued as basic medical supplies. And here is the worst part. Many soldiers survived the war, only to bring diseases back home. By World War II, the policy completely reversed. Condoms were widely distributed across the U.S. military. It was one of the few times history showed that brutal battlefield data defeated moral debate. Then, in the 1980s, HIV/AIDS emerged, and the terror returned, remarkably similar to Europe centuries prior. Before this, latex condoms were primarily seen as a contraceptive method, but the AIDS pandemic transformed it into a global public health tool. Commercials, schools, hospitals, national campaigns, everything changed in less than a decade. And history repeated itself in the most familiar way. A new pandemic forced humanity back to the exact same old question: how to reduce the risk before it's too late. Conclusion: the final punch. Back to London in 1700. In a small workshop near the meat market, the worker is still toiling. His hands are wet, the stench of blood from the morning still clinging to his clothes. Every day, he processes animal intestines, stretches them, inflates them by mouth to check the seal, and dries each product before nightfall. There are no brand names on them. A portion is sold to the aristocracy. A portion vanishes into brothels and places history rarely fully records. He does not know who Charles Goodyear is. He doesn't know what latex is. He certainly couldn't imagine that a few centuries later. What he is making in this room filled with blood and organs would become a global industrial product. But in reality, the principle has never changed. Humans are always trying to create a fragile barrier between pleasure and consequence. And perhaps that is the strangest part of this entire story. After more than 300 years, the world has changed almost everything except the question the London worker in 1700 was trying to solve.